United States History by Joseph Jarrell, Chapter 13. A House Dividing, 1848 to 1861. The 1850s was perhaps America's most divisive decade since nationhood. The 1860s, its most divisive. The one decade prepared the way for the other. Although in 1858 Senator William Stewart termed the coming war an irrepressible conflict, the 1850s had actually provided many opportunities for peace and compromise. But like sand in an hourglass, these diminished with time. Americans of that day have rightly been called the blundering generation. Extremists in both the North and the South, with their often ruthless speeches, tore at the cords of union, and most people were merely content to watch them. Number 1 controversy: new territories, old questions. As a result of the annexation of Texas and the Mexican War, the United States made the largest acquisition of territory in its history, larger even than the Louisiana Purchase. With the new lands came a revival of old problems. This time, however, the problems did not go away. They continued to fester throughout the 1850s and finally plunged the nation into war. Events seemed to confirm the gloomy prediction by poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. During the Mexican War, he wrote, "The United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows arsenic, which brings him down in turn. Mexico will poison us." Wilmot Proviso. In 1846, President Polk sent a bill to Congress requesting funds to pursue negotiations with Mexico even while the fighting was occurring. A Democratic representative from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, attached an amendment to the bill that became known as the Wilmot Proviso. It proposed that the United States prohibit slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico. The South was outraged, and Southerners in the Senate kept the proviso from becoming law. Nevertheless, Wilmot's amendment became a rallying point for anti-slavery forces. Over the next few years, anti-slavery congressmen repeatedly offered the Wilmot Proviso to Congress. Several times the act passed the House, only to be rejected by the Senate. Calhoun Resolution. Reacting to the threat of the Wilmot Proviso, many Southerners rallied to the position of Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. In Calhoun resolutions, offered to the Senate in 1847, Calhoun outlined the Southern view of the status of slavery in the territories. Territories are the common possession of the states and not the federal government, Calhoun argued. Therefore, slave owners have the same constitutional protection of their property, including slaves, in the territories as they have in their home states. Neither Congress nor territorial legislatures, Calhoun said, had the right to limit slavery. Only when a territory became a state could it prohibit slavery. Although Congress had previously prohibited slavery in some territories under the Missouri Compromise, Calhoun claimed that such measures were extra-constitutional acts that the South had permitted simply to preserve the Union. Popular sovereignty. Between the positions of Wilmot and Calhoun arose a compromise proposal known as popular sovereignty. The residents of the territory should decide the status of slavery in their territory. If the majority of voters wanted slavery, they could have it. If they did not want it, they could prohibit it. The doctrine of popular sovereignty was strongest among the Democrats. Lewis Cass of Michigan and later Stephen Douglas of Illinois became its leading proponents. Election of 1848. In the presidential election campaign of 1848, the Democrats nominated Lewis Cass. Champion of popular sovereignty, the Whigs decided to avoid the question altogether. They nominated Zachary Taylor, hero of the Mexican War. Although Taylor owned slaves on his plantation in Mississippi, his political views were little known. In fact, Taylor had never even voted in a presidential election. Copying their successful formula of 1840, the Whigs nominated a general, avoided adopting a platform, and emphasized instead the military achievements of their candidate. The positions of Cass and Taylor were not likely to please either the anti-slavery forces or free soilers. Those who favored allowing anti-slavery forces where it already existed but opposed its extension into the territories, the anti-slavery and free soil groups joined forces to form a third party, the Free Soil Party. Under the slogan Free Soil, Free Speech, Free Labor, and Free Men, the new party warmly supported the Wilmot Proviso and nominated former President Martin Van Buren as its candidate. With Van Buren attracting dissatisfied Democrats in the North, particularly in New York, Taylor won a narrow victory over Cass. The new president faced a difficult situation. A dramatic discovery in California was about to spark a renewal of the sectional controversy. California Gold Rush. Swiss immigrant John Sutter arrived in California in 1839, while the region was still under Mexican control. After obtaining a grant of 50,000 acres of land from the Mexican government, Sutter began building a large, self-sufficient ranch at the junction of the Sacramento and American River, the site of the modern city of Sacramento. The transfer of California from Mexico to the United States in 1848 did not affect Sutter at first. He continued his construction, planned to build a sawmill to provide lumber for his extensive ranch, and in 1848, during the building of the mill, one of Sutter's foremen found some glittering stones below the mill's water wheel. The stones, he soon discovered, were gold. The foreman took the gold to Sutter, who tried to keep the matter quiet. Such news, however, was impossible to conceal. Word spread, first throughout California, then back to the eastern United States and overseas. Gold fever seized thousands of otherwise sensible men and drew them to California, where wealth was seemingly theirs for the taking. The California gold rush began because the first wave of gold hunters came in 1849. They all became known as the 49ers. Most 49ers followed the overland route to California, like the pioneers who had followed the Oregon Trail. A number, particularly on the East Coast, went by sea. Some sailed to Central America, crossed the narrow bridge of land by mule and canoe, and tried to find a ship on the Pacific side going to California. Some took all water route, the long and dangerous journey around the southern tip of South America. In all, some 80,000 men came to California in 1849, and more than 400,000 came in the 10 years from 1848 to 1858. Seeking gold was a gamble. Only a few people were winners, and many gambled their savings, their occupations, and even their lives, believing that they would win. Some who hoped to strike it rich died in shipwrecks or on the trail, without ever even reaching California. Those who successfully staked claims found that standing in water all day, wielding a pick and shovel, was hard, discouraging work. The few who found rich ore, however, if they were not murdered or swindled out of their claims, became wealthy and inspired stories that encouraged the others to come. Regardless of whether a prospector found gold, he seldom left California. The trip home was too long, and the beauty of the region too appealing. Ironically, one man who did not share in the wealth was John Sutter. Much of his land was overrun by greedy gold hunters. He never profited from the gold rush that began there. Statehood question. The rush of people into California resulted in governmental chaos. The military rule installed after the Mexican War proved insufficient to govern the large number of sometimes unruly 49ers. Out of necessity, California organized a government encouraged by President Taylor. California decided to skip territorial stage, write a constitution, and apply for admission to the Union as a free state in 1849. Southerners opposed the move. The admission of California would upset the balance between slave and free states in the Senate. Many Southern leaders also wanted Congress to clarify what would be done with the other lands taken from Mexico, the Utah and New Mexico territories. Some Southerners even talked of secession, withdrawing their state from the Union. An old, bitter, divisive controversy was heating up again. The Great Debate. The West was driving a new wedge between the North and the South. The resulting crisis was evident on the Senate floor in what was perhaps the most extraordinary debate in congressional history. Three aging giants, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, entered the political arena for the last time. The trio had begun their congressional careers in the days of Madison, when they and the nation were young. Now, old warriors were searching for a peaceful solution to calm the Republic's troubled waters. Compromise of 1850. Henry Clay became known as the Great Compromiser because he had a major role in formulating three landmark agreements: the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the Compromise Tariff of 1833, and now the Compromise of 1850. As a secession to the North, he proposed that number 1, California be admitted as a free state, and that 2, the slave trade, but not slavery itself, be abolished in the District of Columbia. To the pro-slavery forces he offered 3, a new and more effective slave law, which required that all escaped slaves be returned to their masters, and 4, the protection of slavery in the District of Columbia. In addition, Clay offered the two sides a joint concession, proposing that 5, the new territories of New Mexico and Utah be organized, and the slavery question there would be decided by popular sovereignty. Clay's proposals, collectively known as the Compromise of 1850, underwent intense debate from all sides. President Taylor opposed the compromise for making a concession that might extend slavery into the territories. He thought debate on the compromise would succeed only in deepening sectional division and delaying the admission of new territories. The aging Calhoun came to the Senate on March 4th to present the South's position. Gravely ill and suffering intensely, he would be dead within 3 weeks. Calhoun was too weak to speak, but gave his written remarks to a fellow senator to read. Calhoun declared that the compromise did not go far enough in protecting Southern rights. Constitutional guarantees needed to be extended so that neither section could dominate the other. He argued that the Southern states might secede from the country. 3 days later, the eloquent Daniel Webster rose to speak. His 7th of March speech was the most crucial and courageous of his distinguished career. Webster declared, "I wish to speak today, not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. Hear me for my cause." Webster then noted that the bounds of slavery were already set by the Northwest Ordinance and the Missouri Compromise, as well as by geography. The barren conditions of the new territories could not support a slave economy anyway. Therefore, the Wilmot Proviso was needless and provocative. The silver-tongued senator then turned his arguments in favor of union and compromise against the extremists in both sections. Webster blasted the abolitionists in the North and scolded the hot-headed secessionists in the South. Secession, peaceable secession. Sir, your eyes and mine are never destined to see the miracle. If either extreme prevailed, Webster believed, the future was a cavern of darkness. A far brighter future for the nation lay in liberty and union. Abolitionists heaped every abusive adjective available upon Webster for his speech. Despite such criticism, Webster's support of the compromise was a critical factor in sparing the country war and disunion. Another factor in the passage of the compromise was the sudden removal of one of its most influential critics when President Taylor died. When the Vice President, Millard Fillmore, succeeded to the presidency, he solidly backed Clay's proposal. By September, they had passed Congress and were signed into law. Sectional strains. The Compromise of 1850 brought a shaky sense of relief. Tensions eased for a time even within the political parties. In 1852, the controversies over slavery expansion that had torn the Democrats apart in 1848 were laid aside. The Democrats' platform and their nominee, Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire, were solidly behind the compromise. Evidently, most of the voters were too. Pierce won a lopsided electoral victory in both the South and the North over the Whigs' candidate, General Winfield Scott. The Free Soilers, who continued to support the Wilmot Proviso, polled only 155,210 votes of more than 3 million cast. Ironically, the peace that the compromise produced was soon shaken by the compromise itself. One of its provisions, a secession to the South, was a new, tougher Fugitive Slave Act. The return of runaway slaves to bondage became a powerful emotional tool of the abolitionists in gradually turning public opinion. A number of them, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, urged citizens to break the law on the earliest occasion, and several northern states practiced a version of nullification by passing personal liberty laws. These laws prohibited the imprisonment of runaway slaves and, in violation of the Fugitive Slave Act, guaranteed jury trials to them. Even some Northerners who were not abolitionists supported such measures. They feared that the lack of safeguards in the new federal law could result in free black Americans being kidnapped and sent into slavery. Of course, Southern slaveholders were furious with Northern resistance to the federal statute. By the 1850s, some abolitionists were no longer just denouncing slavery, they were attacking the South itself by portraying it as an evil culture built on the backs of black slaves. Although approximately one-fourth of Southern families owned slaves, the abolitionist attacks had a decisive effect on Southerners. Many grew defensive and tried to portray slavery as positive, attempting to promote it as good and noble, stating that slaves had a better life than many of the poor in the North and in other countries. The most radical Southerners were the fire eaters, extremists who advocated the Southerns leaving the Union as the only way to preserve the Southern way of life. Communication began to break down. Institutions that bound the region together, such as religious denominations and political parties, fell apart along sectional lines. After 1850, the common ground of compromise would be increasingly difficult to find. Number 2. Conflict. Kansas-Nebraska Act. Despite the growing sectional conflicts and its own weaknesses, the Compromise of 1850 postponed war for several years. The overwhelming support for the pro-compromise Democrats, led by presidential candidate Franklin Pierce in 1852, would certainly seem to indicate that most Americans wanted an end to bitter and divisive struggles. The wounds of sectional conflict were unwittingly reopened in 1854, however, by the actions of the major Democratic leader of the 1850s, Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois. Douglas, like many perceptive Americans of his time, envisioned the construction of a transcontinental railroad linking the East and the Far West. The United States had arranged the Gadsden Purchase from Mexico, for example, as part of the potential southern route for such a line. Douglas, like most politicians, wanted his home state to benefit from the railroad by having a pass through Illinois. A transcontinental route from that state, however, would have to go through the unorganized portion of the Louisiana Purchase, which lay west of Missouri. The region would need an organized government to allow construction and maintenance of the line. Many Southerners opposed territorial organization, though, because of the still unanswered questions about the expansion of slavery. Douglas sought to win Southern support for his railroad by a clever piece of legislation. In the Kansas-Nebraska Act 1854, the Illinois senator proposed organizing two territories from the region, the Kansas Territory, just west of Missouri, and the Nebraska Territory, just west of Iowa. To settle the slavery issue, Douglas returned to the idea of popular sovereignty. Each territory would decide the status of slavery for itself. To make popular sovereignty work and to please Southern congressmen, the act repealed the provision of the Missouri Compromise that banned slavery north of 360 degrees latitude. Southerners, of course, welcomed this opportunity to expand slavery into an area that had been previously closed to it. Northern resistance, on the other hand, was strong. Due to the large Democratic majority in Congress and the support of nearly all the South, the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. Afterward, a storm of protest erupted from the North and West as people objected to both the extending of slavery and the abandoning of the Missouri Compromise. Douglas bore much of the fury himself, but his party did not escape. More than two-thirds of the incumbent Northern Democrats in Congress lost their seats in the next election. Only 7 of the 44 Northern Democrats in the House who voted for the act were reelected. More important, the Kansas-Nebraska Act resulted in 2 events that eventually destroyed the Democratic Party dominance of American politics: the rise of the Republican Party and a virtual civil war in Kansas. Rise of the Republicans. Collapse of the Whigs. The Whigs had never been a strongly unified party. It existed primarily as a coalition of various opponents to Democratic policies. The 2 times the party won a presidential election, 1840 and 1848, it had done so in part by refusing to adopt a platform. The poor showing in the presidential election of 1852 weakened the Whigs. The Kansas-Nebraska Act destroyed them. Southern Whigs almost unanimously supported the act. Northern Whigs almost unanimously opposed it. No political party could survive such a traumatic split. Within a few years, the Whigs had disappeared completely, and their collapse left a huge hole in Americans' political party system. The Know-Nothings. At a time, it seemed that the Whigs might be replaced by the American Party, better known as the Know-Nothings. The Know-Nothings arose in reaction to increasing immigration from Europe in the 1840s and 50s. Problems such as the potato famine in Ireland and the conflicts in Germany sent hundreds of thousands of Europeans fleeing to America for refuge. Many Americans feared that the immigrants would take jobs from the native-born Americans. The fact that many of the immigrants were Catholic also caused uneasiness among Protestants. Some Catholic monarchs in Europe practiced tyranny and repression, and American Protestants feared that Catholics might somehow interfere with democratic institutions in the United States. In 1854, the Know-Nothings capitalized on both fear of immigrants and resentment of the Kansas-Nebraska Act to score big gains in Congress and state legislatures. Though the Know-Nothings were stronger in the North, they displayed surprising strength in slave states such as Kentucky and Texas. The movement proved to be a passing fad, however. Simple negativism was not a strong base on which to build a party, and the northern and southern wings of the Know-Nothings had almost as little in common as the Northern and Southern Whigs. After the 1856 presidential election, most Southern Know-Nothings eventually joined the Democrats. A number of Northern Know-Nothings joined a new party, the Republicans. The real successor to the Whigs was the Republican Party. Although many cities compete for the title birthplace of the Republican Party, the honor seems to go to Ripon, Wisconsin. On February 28, 1854, a rally of those opposed to the Kansas-Nebraska Act in the town called for others of like mind to join under the label of Thomas Jefferson's old party, Republican. Soon the Republican movement spread across the North, and the party was able to offer candidates in the 1854 election. The Republicans began as a generally anti-slavery party, but even the description covers a wide range of beliefs. Abolitionists naturally gravitated to the Republicans. Free Soilers, those who opposed the expansion of slavery, also joined. Sadly, the party's opposition to slavery did not necessarily mean that all of its members had the interests of the slaves at heart. In fact, some Free Soilers were more interested in preserving the territories for white settlers than in helping black slaves. The appeal of the Republicans was by no means built entirely on the slavery issue. The Republicans adopted many of the pro-business, nationalistic ideas of the Whigs, such as the protective tariffs and government support of roads, railroads, and other internal improvements. Many Know-Nothings joined as well. If for no other reason, then the Democrats seemed to be the party of the immigrants. Republicans appealed to the small farmer by promising the distribution of inexpensive land to settlers in the Western territories. Despite this range of interests, though, the Republicans remained strictly a sectional party. They were non-existent in the South. Elections of 1856. The election of 1856 revealed both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Republicans and marked the decline of the Know-Nothings. Borrowing from the Whigs' tactics of choosing a hero as a presidential candidate, the Republicans bypassed their most prominent political leaders, such as New York Senator William Seward. They instead nominated explorer soldier John C. Fremont, Pathfinder of the West, and a popular Mexican War commander. The Republicans also borrowed from the Free Soil slogan of 1848, as they said that they were for free speech, free press, free soil, free men, Fremont, and victory. The American Party, Know-Nothings, nominated former President Millard Fillmore, but his devotion to the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic principle of the party was at best lukewarm. In fact, Fillmore's daughter had been educated by nuns. The Democrats ignored their colorless incumbent, Franklin Pierce, and nominated an accomplished, though lackluster, legislator and diplomat, James Buchanan. As a native Pennsylvanian who was generally sympathetic to the South, Buchanan seemed the ideal candidate to unite all factions of the party. Also, he had been ambassador to Great Britain since 1853 and was therefore, unlike prominent Democrats such as Stephen Douglas, not associated with the controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. Running on a platform defending popular sovereignty, Buchanan offered himself as a safe, sensible alternative to the extremists, Fremont and Fillmore. Fremont proved successful in the North and West, carrying 11 states and winning 114 electoral votes. Fillmore, though winning many popular votes, carried only Maryland with its 8 electoral votes. However, Buchanan, as the head of the only party with a truly nationwide following, carried the entire South and enough northern states to win 174 electoral votes and the election. Again, the voters had chosen the moderate middle course. Signs of trouble were evident. Buchanan had won only a plurality, not a majority, of the votes, and several Southern leaders had threatened secession during the campaign if Fremont won. Bleeding Kansas. During the 1856 campaign, Republicans repeatedly criticized the increasingly troublesome situation in the Kansas Territory. Douglas's system of popular sovereignty meant that the settlers there would decide the fate of slavery. As a result, large numbers of pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates streamed into the territory, each side attempting to win the region for its position. Savage fighting occurred between the two factions, and the dissension-torn territory became known as the Bleeding Kansas. Lawrence. The situation in Kansas steadily worsened. Thousands of pro-slavery Missourians, called border ruffians in the newspapers, and anti-slavery forces known as the Free Staters, clashed in open violence. In May of 1856, 3 events within the span of 5 days from May 21st to 25th brought the Kansas conflict to national attention. First, on May 21st, an army of border ruffians attacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas, a center of anti-slavery settlers. Because the citizens chose not to resist the attackers, only 1 man died, a ruffian who was killed when a collapsing building fell on him. However, the ruffians freely burned, looted, and destroyed the town, the sack of Lawrence, outraged Free Staters. Sumner-Brooks episode. About the same time, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, a fiery abolitionist, gave a heated Senate speech denouncing the crime against Kansas. For 2 days, he verbally attacked his colleagues who supported slavery. He made particularly abusive statements about Andrew Butler, a senator from South Carolina. Butler was not present to defend himself, and 2 days later, just a day after the sack of Lawrence, Representative Preston Brooks of South Carolina, Butler's cousin, confronted Sumner in the nearly empty Senate chamber. The harsh language the Massachusetts senator had used was inexcusable, but Brooks' response was hardly justified. As Sumner sat at his desk, Brooks began to hit him repeatedly with a cane. Brooks continued to beat him mercilessly until Sumner was bloody and badly injured. Several senators stood idly by or kept others from interfering. To the north, Brooks's action confirmed the prejudice that Southern leaders were violent beasts. The Southerners' reaction did not help matters. Brooks' district overwhelmingly re-elected him to the House, and admirers from all over the South sent him new canes. Brooks wrote proudly, "The fragments of the stick are begged for a sacred relic." Because of his injuries, Sumner did not return to the Senate for over 2 years. Brooks was later convicted of assault and assessed a fine, but received no prison sentence. Many Southerners praised Brooks for his actions. Pottawatomie Massacre. The news of the Sumner-Brooks episode enraged one Northerner to a murderous fury. John Brown was a fanatical abolitionist from Connecticut who had come to Kansas to help win the territory for the anti-slave forces. A failure in every business venture he attempted, he soon dedicated himself to the anti-slavery cause. The sack of Lawrence infuriated Brown not only because the border ruffians had attacked the town, but also because the Free Staters had not fought back. Furthermore, when he received news of Brooks's beating of Sumner, Brown, in the words of his son, went crazy. Crazy. Gathering his followers about him on the night of May 24th and 5th, he sought revenge by attacking several pro-slavery families along the Pottawatomie Creek. In the grisly Pottawatomie Massacre, Brown's men butchered 5 pro-slavery settlers with razor-sharp swords. 3 episodes within a week, the sack of Lawrence, the Sumner-Brooks episode, and the Pottawatomie Massacre, highlighted how the deep, divisive issue of slavery could easily become violent. By the end of 1856, more than 200 people were killed in Kansas during the dozens of bloody incidents. John Brown was never arrested or tried for the Kansas murders. Soon he had returned east, where he was hailed as a hero among some of the abolitionist movement. The Dred Scott Decision. On March 6 of 1857, only 2 days after James Buchanan took office, the Supreme Court handed down a decision that further compounded the conflict over slavery. The case Dred Scott v. Sanford revealed that even the Supreme Court could not provide a solution to the problems that so troubled the nation. Dred Scott was the slave of an army surgeon from Missouri, and during 1830s he had taken Scott to the Free State of Illinois and the unorganized Free Territory of the Louisiana Purchase. The owner later returned to Missouri, a slave state, with Scott. After the owner's death in 1843, Scott sought to gain his freedom on the grounds that he had become free by entering free territory and could not be re-enslaved. The case eventually found its way to the Supreme Court. With its pro-Southern majority, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Roger Taney, welcomed the opportunity to settle the slavery question. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, the court ruled that a slave was not a citizen and had no right to sue. According to the Chief Justice, the Constitution did not recognize slaves or free blacks as citizens. Black men, in Taney's words, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Taney then went on to examine the Missouri Compromise, which he ruled unconstitutional on the grounds that it had unfairly deprived slaveholders of their property in territories north of the 36 degrees. Of course, Taney's decision that Congress could not forbid slavery in the territories was hailed in the South and denounced in the North. It made slavery theoretically legal in all territories. It was now unclear whether or not slavery could be excluded from the territory by use of popular sovereignty. The decision only worsened sectional conflict. Animosity grew. Lincoln-Douglas debates. One man caught in the crossfire over the Dred Scott decision was Stephen A. Douglas. Although Douglas personally did not care whether a territory adopted or prohibited slavery, he strongly maintained under the doctrine of popular sovereignty that the citizens of the territory had the right to decide for themselves. In light of the Dred Scott case, Douglas had to find a way to reconcile popular sovereignty with the Supreme Court's ruling, in what became known as the Freeport Doctrine. After one of the cities in Illinois where he promoted the idea, Douglas argued that a territory could still prohibit slavery by refusing to adopt laws establishing and protecting it. Douglas's Freeport Doctrine, as one would expect, drew the wrath of the pro-slavery forces. Douglas's political career was further threatened when he disagreed with President Buchanan regarding Kansas. Pro-slavery forces in that territory had managed to devise a state constitution that established slavery. Although the majority of settlers were free staters, Buchanan, eager to please the South and bring Kansas into the Union, as a Democratic state, pushed Congress to accept the slavery constitution and admit Kansas. Douglas led a courageous group of Democrats who resisted the administration's attempt to oppose the will of the majority in Kansas. Under pressure from the Republicans and the Douglas Democrats, Congress put the Constitution to a vote in the territory, and the Kansas rejected it overwhelmingly. As Douglas prepared to run for re-election in 1858, he faced opposition from his own Democratic president. In addition, the Republican Party had grown markedly stronger in Illinois and was offering a strong challenger to Douglas, Illinois lawyer Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln. The story of Abraham Lincoln's life sounds like one of the classic rags to riches tales. He was born into a family of a poor farmer living near Hodgenville, Kentucky in 1809. The family moved to southern Indiana when Abraham was only 7. In both places, the Lincoln family experienced the crushing poverty that burdened many settlers on the frontier. Young Lincoln spent his youth performing the back-breaking labor of a pioneer farmer, clearing and cultivating the land, splitting rails for fence, and trying to help keep his family from starving. Lincoln's standard of living improved when the family moved to Illinois in 1830. There, Lincoln was able to find work as a store clerk, postmaster, and surveyor. He had always had a desire for education, but was able to attend school only infrequently. His formal education probably totaled about a year. However, Lincoln became an avid reader, eagerly consuming the works of Shakespeare, the poems of Robert Burns, and the Bible. He also began to study law on his own, and in 1836 he was licensed to practice. Lincoln also developed a taste for politics. He joined the Whig Party, headed by his idol Kentuckian Henry Clay, and became an influential leader in the Illinois Party. He served 4 terms in the Illinois state legislature from 1834 to 1842, and 1 term as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, 1847 to 1849. By 1850, however, Lincoln had left politics to devote himself to his profitable law practice in Springfield, Illinois. Abraham Lincoln's character was a mixture of genuine kindness, personal ambition, and unflinching determination. His reputation for honesty earned him the nickname Honest Abe. Even political opponent Stephen Douglas said that Abraham is as honest as he is shrewd. His thoughtfulness and generosity, not to mention his sense of humor and the talent for telling amusing stories, charmed those who met him. The driving force behind his political thinking was that slavery was wrong. He often quoted the Declaration of Independence's famous phrase, "All men are created equal." Later, Lincoln said that his election to the presidency, "I have never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence." Primary among those sentiments, he said, was the promise that in due time the weights would be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance. Yet Lincoln was a realist. He knew that slavery could not be easily eliminated. He believed that the federal government had no right to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. Lincoln satisfied himself with the free soil doctrine that slavery should not be allowed to expand any farther. He condemned popular sovereignty because it attempted to avoid the moral concerns about slavery. The territories must be kept free. Perhaps then, Lincoln thought, slavery would eventually die out. The Kansas-Nebraska Act brought Lincoln out of his political retirement. "I was losing interest in politics," Lincoln wrote in 1859, "when the repeal of the Missouri Compromise aroused me again." Lincoln denounced the act because it offered the possibility of slavery's expansion into the territories. His eloquence and folksy, relaxed manner pleased listeners and attracted the attention of many. Conservative by nature, Lincoln tried to work within the dying Whig Party. Eventually, however, he realized that the Republicans offered him a better political future, and by 1858 he was the leading Republican in Illinois and the natural choice to oppose incumbent Stephen Douglas for the U.S. Senate. The debates. Lincoln launched the campaign by giving one of the most famous speeches, quoting in part from Mark 3:25. Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Douglas immediately charged Lincoln with promoting conflict and discord. After all, Douglas argued, the nation that existed as half slave and half free since its founding, why should it not continue to do so? Lincoln responded by challenging Douglas to a series of debates. Douglas accepted, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates became a platform for not only the Illinois election, but also the national debate on slavery. Lincoln and Douglas met 7 times at different sites in Illinois. Douglas continued to promote popular sovereignty as the answer to the slavery question. He also played on the racist prejudice of his listeners by accusing Lincoln of preaching that absolute equality of the races. "I do not believe that the Almighty ever intended the Negro to be equal with the white man," said Douglas. "He belongs to an inferior race and must always occupy an inferior position." Put on the defensive, Lincoln, reflecting the prejudice of the day, retreated from the issue of equality. "I am not, nor have ever been in favor of bringing about in any way the social political equality of the white and black races," he told one audience. Lincoln refused to deny that slavery was immoral, however, and restated his conviction that its expansion must be prohibited. In another town, Lincoln declared, "Notwithstanding all this, there is no reason in the world why the Negro is not entitled to all the natural rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the right to eat the bread without the leave of everybody else, which his own hand earns, he is my equal, and the equal of Stephen Douglas, and the equal of every man living." believing that slavery should be treated as a wrong, and one of the methods of treating it as a wrong is to make provision that it shall grow no larger. When the state legislature chose a senator, Douglas won the close election and continued to serve in the Senate. Although Lincoln lost, he had gained national attention for his views, and 2 years later, Lincoln would win a greater prize. Number 3, crisis. John Brown's raid. While politicians debated the slavery matter, John Brown continued his work. Several months after his grisly Pottawatomie murders, he appeared in the plush parlors of Boston's elite. That Brown could gather such audiences says as much about the temper of the times as about the charisma of the man. Between 1857 and 1859, Brown raised money and an army for his grand but ill-conceived scheme to start a slave revolt in the South. His far-fetched plan of mass murder and violence seemed to confirm Brown's strange mental state, yet a group of supporters known as the Secret Six, which included some of the most prominent clergymen and abolitionists in the Northeast, endorsed the plan. In addition, dozens of others were aware of Brown's intentions. Brown's ties with such well-placed supporters, revealed after the plot unraveled, would further poison sectional relations. Raid on Harper's Ferry. In the fall of 1859, Brown and several followers moved secretly to a farmhouse near Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now West Virginia, to wait for promised supplies to arrive from supporters in New England. In October, Brown was ready to attack the Federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, strategically located at the junction of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers. Brown expected to capture the arsenal and its large supply of weapons for a spontaneous slave revolt. He apparently believed that enough slaves and abolitionists would join him to make the plan successful. During the night of October 16, 1859, Brown and his gang of 21 raiders captured the arsenal and cut the telegraph lines. By the next morning, alarmed citizens and militia from Harper's Ferry and nearby towns had surrounded the arsenal. As the day wore on, several people on both sides were mortally wounded, including 2 of Brown's sons. Ironically, the first person that Brown's raiders killed was a free black man working as a baggage man on the train. Word of the raid spread quickly. Colonel Robert E. Lee received orders to take command of Federal troops in the area and recapture the arsenal. On the morning of October 18th, Lee ordered a detachment of Marines under the command of Lieutenant James Ewell Brown, Jeb Stuart, to take Brown's stronghold, and after a brief fight, Brown and his remaining raiders were captured and jailed. Aftermath. At his trial, Brown was convicted of murder and treason. He spent November in prison awaiting execution. Southerners were, of course, eager for the man who had such ruthless designs against them to receive his just reward. A number of Republicans, embarrassed by Brown's ties to their party, were also eager that he would soon be silenced. As for the old man himself, he eagerly awaited his execution date. The self-styled martyr saw it as a date with destiny in which he would gain greater glory than he had achieved in life. In a letter to his wife, Brown wrote, "I have been whipped, sick, as the saying is, but am sure I can recover all the lost capital occasioned by that disaster, by only hanging a few moments by the neck, and I feel quite determined to make the utmost possible out of this defeat." On December 2nd of 1859, John Brown's body swung from a noose in Charleston, Virginia. But this was no routine execution. It was the inauguration of a period of mourning in the North that shocked the South by its excess. Buildings were draped with black, church bells rang, and poets and pulpiteers poured out their most eloquent words on Brown, so recently convicted of murder and treason. Abolitionists found his death a useful symbol, and such famous writers as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, and Louisa May Alcott compared Brown to Christ. Ironically, Thoreau also called Brown an angel of light, apparently unaware that this is a scriptural name for Satan in 2 Corinthians 11:14. In that context, most Southerners would have heartily agreed with Thoreau. The majority of Northerners, however, did not support slave revolts or Brown's methods. Lincoln noted that although Brown agreed with us in thinking slavery was wrong, that cannot excuse violence, bloodshed, and treason. Others went even further, denouncing Brown's actions as among the gravest of crimes. These voices of moderation, however, were not being heard in the South above the increasing clamor. Understandably, Unionist sympathies in the South were evaporating, and the fear of both secret plots and slave revolts multiplied after Harper's Ferry. Across Dixie, Brown's ties with Republican leaders meant guilt by association. If the Republican came to power, Southerners believed the South was not safe. Such dark thoughts foretold ill of the future as the nation stumbled into a new and fateful year of 1860. Election of 1860. The election of 1860 was probably the most critical contest in American politics. Perhaps, with the nation so divided following the Harper's Ferry plot, it was not a good time to be choosing a new president. But the Constitution required it. The outcome of the campaign would shatter the last truly national institution tying the section together, the Democratic Party, and serve as a stimulus for dissolving the Union. Democratic division. The Democratic Party held its convention in Charleston, South Carolina in April of 1860. As it began, Stephen Douglas was generally the preferred presidential nominee over the incumbent James Buchanan. The struggle over the party platform had created a serious rift. Douglas supporters wanted simply to follow the 1856 platform, which called for congressional non-interference with the slave question in the territories and the use of popular sovereignty. A number of representatives from the Deep South state called for federal protection of slavery in their territories. Buchanan supporters, trying to deny Douglas the nomination, advocated this idea. When the Northern delegates rejected the proposal, delegates from several Southern states left the convention. Eventually, the sectional factions reconvened separately in Baltimore. Northern Democrats nominated Douglas, while Southern Democrats nominated Buchanan's Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. In addition, a new group emerged. It was a coalition of conservative Southerners and Northerners, including many former Whigs, calling themselves the Constitutional Union Party. They nominated John Bell, a former U.S. Senator from Tennessee, for the presidency. The Constitutional Union platform was probably the most concise in American history. The Constitution of the country, the Union of the state, and the enforcement of the laws, Bell's party, representing much of the sentiment in the Upper South and border states, offered a pro-Union alternative to those who believed that a Republican victory would bring disunion. Despite the attempts by all the Democratic factions to keep the Union intact in their own way, the division of their ranks virtually ensured Republican success. Lincoln's victory. Republicans met in Chicago for their convention. Although William Seward seemed to be the favorite for the nomination, Abraham Lincoln won the top spot on the ticket. The Republican platform reflected the coalition character of the party. The party opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories and supported a protective tariff for Northern business interests. It also endorsed a transcontinental railroad and opening of Western lands to appeal to farmers and immigrants. The Republicans also tried to calm Southern fears by pledging not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. The presidential campaign was really two sectional races, Lincoln and Douglas competing in the North, Bell and Breckinridge in the South, and border states. Douglas became the first presidential candidate to make a nationwide campaign tour, including the South, where he did not expect many votes. With the Democrats hopelessly divided, Lincoln won by a plurality with just under 40% of the popular vote. Since his sectional strength was confined to the more populous North, however, he gained a strong majority in the Electoral College. Secession. The election results triggered disunion. Many leaders in the Deep South had promised that if Lincoln won, they would not submit themselves to what they considered a hostile, strictly Northern party. They would secede and leave the Union. South Carolina led the way on December 20th, 1860. By unanimously approving an ordinance of secession. It was South Carolina's Declaration of Independence. By February 1st of 1861, 6 more states in the Deep South, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, had joined South Carolina in seceding. On February 8th, in Montgomery, Alabama, those 7 southern states formed the Confederate State of America, or the Confederacy. Jefferson Davis, a former senator from Mississippi and the Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce, was elected president of the newly declared nation. Attempts at compromise. As the nation unraveled, men frantically searched for a compromise. Unfortunately, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun were dead. Men of lesser ability now governed. Buchanan sat in the White House fretting, frustrated and divisive. President-elect Lincoln repeated his campaign promise not to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. But he refused to commit himself to any course of action until he took office and personally held the reins of power. As precious time slipped away in the weeks following the election, Senator John C. Crittenden of Kentucky proposed a series of constitutional amendments that would reinstate the Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees for the Western territories and guarantee the protection of slavery where it already existed. Crittenden made a notable effort to save the Union and preserve the peace, but his compromise ultimately failed in the Republican-controlled Congress. It was the last, desperate hope to avoid war. Its failures would cost Crittenden dearly. One of his sons would become a general in the Union Army, another a general in the Confederate Army. First fire. Only a spark was needed to bring the country to war. Anger the North over Southern secession, and fear in the South that the North would try to forcibly prohibit such a move meant neither side was eager for reconciliation. The spark was the issue of federal forts in the South, particularly Fort Sumter, strategically centered in the mouth of the Charleston, South Carolina harbor. In early March 1861, the fort remained under the federal government's control. Almost all other forts in the seceding states were now controlled by the Confederacy. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln became president. In his inauguration speech, he pledged again not to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it existed. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. As Lincoln began his term, the Confederacy sent 3 peaceful commissioners to Washington to resolve the problem of federal forts. Both Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Seward, refused to meet the commissioners personally. They thought by doing so would be in effect recognizing the Confederate government. Seward, however, sent word that Fort Sumter would be evacuated on April 7th, confirmed his promise in writing. Although it was unclear whether Lincoln knew of Seward's actions, on April 9th, when the commissioner learned that a squadron of ships had been sent to take supplies to the fort, they concluded that they had been deceived. Lincoln notified the governor of South Carolina of his intentions to send food, but not military supplies, to the fort. Confederate leaders decided to stop the supplies from reaching Sumter. They believed that allowing federal troops to continue to occupy the fort would be a threat to the Confederacy's independence. On the other hand, Lincoln had pledged in his inaugural speech to hold, occupy, and possess federal property in the states that had formed the Confederacy. Therefore, he was clearly opposed to surrendering Fort Sumter. When Lincoln's naval expedition neared Charleston on April 12 of 1861, Federal General Pierre G.T. Beauregard opened fire on Fort Sumter, which was commanded by Major Robert Anderson. Ironically, when Beauregard was a cadet at West Point, his artillery instructor was the same Robert Anderson. Now, Beauregard had an opportunity to show his former teacher just how well he had learned his lessons. After a 2-day bombardment, Anderson surrendered the garrison. Union troops were permitted to leave for New York on steamships. Remarkably, no one on either side had been killed in the 2-day fight. 2 men were killed in an accidental explosion after the battle ended. War, however, had begun. The day after the surrender, Lincoln called for the states still in the Union to supply a total of 75,000 troops to suppress the secessionist states. Many northern states responded readily with troops. Other states were not so cooperative. Extremists in both the North and the South welcomed the war as an opportunity to teach the other region a lesson. In the Upper South, many people had hoped for reconciliation. When Lincoln recruited soldiers to invade the South, 4 additional states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, also seceded. They refused to fight their sister states. They were now 11 states in the Confederate States of America. The time for debate and compromise had slipped through the fingers of leaders. Differences now would be settled by force of clashing of arms rather than with constitutional arguments. The spring of 1861 was the beginning of desolation for the nation. 4 bloody, bitter springtimes would pass before America had exhausted themselves in killing each other.